He rolled his eyes the moment he saw her. Loud, rude, convinced he deserved better, especially better than sitting next to a black woman. But fate doesn't check your prejudice before it changes your life. And what happened after the plane crash? That's where everything turned upside down. Robert was the kind of man people barely noticed until he opened his mouth. In his early 40s, heavy-set, scruffy beard, always a bit too loud for the room. At the airport gate in Dallas, he stood with crossed arms and a face full of impatience. He didn't like lines, didn't like waiting, and definitely didn't like the feeling of not being in control. The moment the boarding gate opened, he pushed ahead, muttering about delays and incompetence. He stepped onto the plane and walked down the aisle, scanning each row like he was owed something better. Then he saw her, Maria, a poised black woman in her early 30s, sitting quietly in the window seat. She was calm, well-dressed, flipping through pages of a dense-looking medical text. Without a word, she gave off a sense of quiet confidence. But that only seemed to irritate Robert more. He stopped cold, narrowed his eyes, and let out a loud scoff. He shook his head like he couldn't believe what he was seeing. Then, without hesitation, he turned to the flight attendant and began complaining, loudly. He didn't want to sit next to a black woman, he said. He called it uncomfortable, said it made him anxious, said something about safety. Passengers turned to stare. Maria looked up, surprised, but didn't respond with anger. Instead, she spoke calmly, introducing herself and explaining she was a doctor on her way to a medical conference. That only made things worse. Robert laughed a dry, condescending sound and said if she was a doctor, then he was a rocket scientist. His voice got louder. The flight attendant tried to intervene, but Robert doubled down, saying he wanted a new seat. He refused to sit next to someone like her. Maria stayed composed. She didn't raise her voice, didn't argue, just looked at him with an expression that said everything without saying a word. After a few tense minutes, the flight attendant returned. Robert had been reassigned to first class. He smirked, slung his carry-on over his shoulder, and walked away like he had won something. Maria remained in her seat, quiet and composed, as if nothing had happened. But the plane hadn't even taken off yet, and neither of them had any idea just how far things were about to fall. The flight took off under clear skies, but turbulence has a way of showing up uninvited. Hours later, somewhere over the open ocean, the calm was shattered by a sudden jolt. The lights flickered. The plane lurched. Screams erupted. Oxygen masks dropped. For a moment, Robert's seat in first class felt like the safest place in the world. That illusion vanished in seconds. The engines sputtered. A sharp descent followed. The last thing most passengers remembered was a deafening roar and the unnatural silence that came right after impact. When Robert opened his eyes, he was soaked, disoriented, face down in wet sand. He scrambled to his feet, coughing up salt water, eyes darting around. Wreckage was scattered across the shoreline of what looked like a deserted island. No signs of rescue, no cell service, no idea how far off course the plane had gone. He shouted for help, for anyone, but only the wind and the waves answered, until he saw her, Maria, calm, alive, and not just surviving already, moving with purpose. She was scanning the wreckage for supplies, dragging broken parts of the plane toward a small clearing. Robert stumbled over, still in shock, still trying to process the crash. When he saw her, his expression twisted. He didn't say thank you. He didn't ask if she was okay. He just stared at her like the world had played some cruel joke. Out of everyone, why her? Why this woman? The same one he had humiliated hours earlier. He muttered under his breath. Something bitter. Something resentful. But she didn't respond. She simply handed him a water bottle and turned away. That silence was louder than anything he could have said. As the sun began to set, it became painfully clear he had no plan, no survival skills, no clue what to do next. And Maria? She had already built a fire, found shelter under part of the fuselage, gathered dry wood. While Robert wandered in circles, she was building a place to sleep. When he asked where she got the matches, she said she had kept them dry in a sealed pouch part of the emergency kit she instinctively grabbed while others panicked. Robert didn't know what stung more, the crash itself or the realization that the woman he dismissed was now the only reason he wasn't completely helpless. And worse, he still couldn't bring himself to admit it. Not yet. By the third day, the heat was unbearable, and the hunger had started to hollow out Robert from the inside. He had tried to act capable, to pretend he was just biding his time until a rescue team arrived. But pretending didn't keep you fed. It didn't keep you dry at night when the storms rolled in, and it didn't build shelter. Maria, on the other hand, had already constructed something that resembled a small hut using palm branches, salvaged seat covers, and reinforced panels from the plane. She had collected clean rainwater using strips of tarp and a carved-out metal tray. She was eating coconuts and roasted fish she managed to catch using improvised tools. Robert watched it all from a distance, arms crossed, too proud to ask for help but too weak to keep up his act. Every time he saw her calmly tying knots or checking for edible plants, something twisted in his chest. Shame, jealousy, confusion. He kept waiting for her to mess up, to panic, to need him for something. But that moment never came. Maria was in control of herself, of the environment, of the silence between them. At one point, she even constructed a crude SOS sign out of debris, placing it on the beach in a visible clearing. Robert had no idea how to contribute. Once, he tried to collect coconuts but gave up after dropping 3 from the tree. Another time, he attempted to start a fire with 2 sticks and ended up with splinters and frustration. Every attempt he made just emphasized the gap between them. Eventually, he stopped trying. He sat near the tree line most of the day, arms around his knees, his stomach growling louder each night. But even then, he refused to speak, refused to say the words. Maria, somehow, still checked on him, left a bottle of water nearby, left pieces of fruit on a flat rock a few feet away. She didn't say it was for him. She didn't need to. And each time, he took it without saying a word. Because pride is a loud thing until survival makes it quiet. And for Robert, the loudest realization was finally hitting him. The woman he had disrespected, dismissed, and degraded was the only reason he hadn't completely fallen apart. Days bled into each other. The sky shifted from endless blue to storm gray and back again. Robert's body had grown weaker, but the weight inside him wasn't just from hunger anymore. It was everything else. The things he had said, the way he had looked at her on the plane, the memory of his own voice, demanding not to sit beside a black woman like Maria, now echoed louder than the waves around them. He hadn't said a real word to her since the crash, just grunts and mumbles, but he had seen everything, every quiet act of leadership, every gesture of kindness she extended without asking for anything in return. And she had done it all without holding his words against him. Or maybe she did, in a way that made her even more powerful, not by punishing him, but by refusing to stoop to where he had been. On the 7th day, the clouds finally broke again. Robert was lying in the shade, dizzy from dehydration, when he heard her call out. Her voice was louder than usual, firm, urgent. He dragged himself to his feet and stumbled toward the beach. A rescue helicopter, a real one, low over the treetops, circling slowly. Maria had lit one of the smoke bundles she'd prepared days earlier, just in case. Her signal worked. The rotors stirred up the sand as the aircraft descended. 2 medics jumped down and ran over. One immediately turned to Robert, who had collapsed into the sand. The medic asked him something, but he couldn't answer. Not right away. His eyes were locked on Maria, standing just a few feet away, watching quietly as the rescue unfolded. For the first time since the crash, Robert cried. Not because he was saved, but because he finally understood who had saved him. He looked at her, shaking, and managed to say it. Not much, just a few broken words, a plea for help, a thank you. Something real, something human. Maria didn't say anything back right away. She just stepped forward, handed him a protein bar, and helped lift him to his feet. As the medics guided them toward the chopper, Robert looked down at the ground he thought would be his grave, then back at the woman who had kept him alive. And for the first time in his life, he wasn't the loudest person in the room. He was just the one who finally understood what dignity looks like and how far it can carry someone when everything else falls apart. As the helicopter lifted off, The island grew smaller beneath them, shrinking into a dot of green surrounded by endless ocean. Robert sat strapped in, silent, head down, eyes unfocused. The wind from the open side door whipped past his face, but he barely felt it. His hands were trembling, not from the cold or the crash, but from something far harder to admit regret. Not just for what had happened on the plane, but for every moment in his life that had led him to believe he was better than someone like Maria. Across from him, Maria sat with a calm that hadn't faded since the crash. Even up here, in the noise and chaos of the rescue, she was steady, focused. One of the medics leaned over to check her vitals. She nodded, answered clearly, and then pointed to Robert. Said he might need fluids, said he hadn't eaten properly in days. She didn't speak to him directly, not yet, but she still made sure someone did. That act alone hit him harder than any injury. The helicopter touched down at a remote medical station set up on a nearby island. Staff rushed to greet them. Cameras clicked. Reporters started forming questions before the blades had even stopped spinning. A nurse wrapped a blanket around Robert's shoulders and asked if he needed anything. He opened his mouth, but no words came out. He didn't know what he needed. Not food, not water, not rest. What he needed couldn't be handed to him. He glanced over at Maria as she stepped off the helicopter. She was surrounded now, doctors, interviewers, rescue workers, thanking her for staying calm, for saving lives, for preparing the signal that got them rescued. They called her a hero. She didn't bask in it. She just nodded, gave clear answers, always composed. When someone asked who else had survived, she simply said there was one other, and that he was lucky to be alive. No bitterness in her voice, no mention of the things he had said on the plane. It would have been so easy for her to turn the spotlight into justice, to shame him, expose him, let the world see what kind of man he had been. But she didn't. She carried herself with something he had never understood before this week: grace. And it was in that moment, standing in the shadow of her quiet strength, that Robert realized what true power actually looks like. Not volume, not control, not money or class or skin color. Just character. And he had almost missed it completely. News of the crash spread quickly. Within hours, headlines filled the internet. Survivor found after days alone on island. Female doctor credited with saving lives. Maria's name was everywhere. Her calm under pressure, her survival instincts, her ability to lead people were captivated. Interviews were requested. A hospital she had never even worked for offered her a job. Academic journals asked for her insights on survival psychology. The world now saw what she had always been. But Robert wasn't in any headlines. He was listed only as another passenger. No one asked for his version of events. No one cared what he had to say. And for once, he didn't mind. He stayed in the medical facility for 2 more days, mostly quiet, mostly alone. Nurses came and went. A few recognized him, asked how he survived. He said as little as possible. What could he say? That he mocked the woman who saved him? That he demanded to sit far away from her, only to owe her his life? On the 3rd day, Maria passed by his room. She wasn't alone. A journalist was trailing her with a notepad. She stopped at his doorway. For a moment, they just looked at each other. No words, no anger, just silence. The journalist asked if this was the man she had survived with. Maria didn't answer right away. She looked at Robert, eyes calm, thoughtful. Then she simply said yes. The journalist pushed for more, but Maria didn't indulge. She just said he had survived, like her, and that was all. Then she turned to go. That pause, that choice not to expose him, not to punish him publicly, that was the moment that changed everything inside him. Later that night, after the hospital cleared him to leave, Robert sat on a bench near the dock, staring out at the dark water. He thought about how close he had come to dying. Not just from the crash, but from pride, from ignorance, from the kind of emptiness that masks itself as superiority. He didn't cry this time. He just sat in stillness, humbled. And for the first time in his life, he began to understand what respect really meant. Not something owed, not something taken, but something earned by people like Maria, who didn't need to prove anything to anyone, because their dignity had already done the talking. Robert returned home a different man, but the world he came back to hadn't changed much. His apartment looked the same, the neighborhood just as noisy, the TV still full of angry voices arguing over things they barely understood. He sat on his old recliner that first night and stared at the blank screen. The crash, the island, Maria, it all felt like a strange fever dream. But the weight in his chest reminded him it had been real. He had the scars to prove it. The next morning, he stood in front of his bathroom mirror and really looked at himself. Not the surface, not the beard or the belly or the lines around his eyes. He looked at the man underneath. The one who had demanded a seat change because of a woman's skin. The one who mocked someone more qualified than him out of nothing but fear and ego. And the one who had eaten from her hands and drank the water she left him because he didn't have the strength to ask. That man was still there, but something had cracked open inside him. He didn't know what to do with it yet. He wasn't the type to journal or call a therapist. But he started small. He wrote a letter. Just a few sentences. To Maria. No address, no email. Just the words. He said, "Thank you." He said he was sorry, not for getting caught, not for surviving, but for being the man he was. He didn't expect to send it. He just needed to write it. A few days later, he searched her name online. The headlines were already fading, but a video surfaced from a talk she gave at a university. She was speaking about leadership, resilience, the psychology of survival. Calm as always, measured, clear. In the middle of the talk, she paused and told a story. Not in detail. She didn't name names, but she talked about how people reveal themselves when stripped of comfort and control, how real strength often comes from the most unexpected places, and how sometimes the people who seem the loudest are the ones who are the most afraid. Robert closed the laptop. He didn't need to hear more. He understood. That story was about him. But it wasn't for him. It was for everyone who still had time to change before it took a crash to wake them up. Weeks passed. Life resumed its steady rhythm. But something had shifted in Robert that didn't unshift. He no longer interrupted cashiers or snapped at strangers in line. He didn't yell at the news, didn't curse at traffic, didn't walk into rooms like they owed him something. People around him noticed, even if they didn't know why. A neighbor he had barely acknowledged before got a nod and a genuine good morning. A cashier who had once gotten an eye roll now got a quiet thank you. These weren't grand gestures. Robert wasn't out to prove anything. He had spent too long believing volume meant power. Now he was learning how strong it is to stay silent. At work, he started listening more. He held the door open instead of rushing through. When a younger colleague, a black man with a soft voice and sharp ideas, pitched something in a meeting, Robert didn't cut him off. He sat back. He let it land. He even spoke up in support. No one clapped or gave him a medal. That wasn't the point. The point was, for once, he wasn't trying to win. He was trying to do better. One afternoon, while reorganizing a drawer at home, he found the letter again. The one he had written to Maria but never sent. He reread it. The paper had creases, like it had been folded and unfolded too many times. He still didn't know if he should send it. Maybe it didn't matter. Maybe the most important part had already happened, the writing. The acknowledging. The changing. That night, he watched the video of her talk again. Not for answers, just to remember. Maria had become a symbol in his mind, not of the crash, but of who he could have been if he had never been challenged. She had shown him a mirror, not by force, but by example. Not once had she told him off or demanded an apology. And yet, everything about her presence, her choices, her composure had rewritten him. Not with lectures, with grace. He shut the laptop, looked out the window, and for the first time in years, felt something strange. Hope, not for being better than anyone, just for being better than he was. Months later, Robert found himself sitting in the back row of a modest auditorium in a community college. It wasn't a place he'd ever imagined being, especially not by choice. But Maria was speaking again this time, not on survival tactics or media interviews, but something more personal. The topic was silent bias and how everyday assumptions shape who gets heard and who gets ignored. He hadn't told anyone he was coming. He didn't even know why he had shown up until he sat down and felt the weight of the moment. She walked on stage with the same quiet confidence she had carried on the island. No flash, no drama, just presence. She started by telling a story, not about the plane crash. That part was over. This story was about her first years as a doctor, the people who looked past her, the patients who asked if the real doctor was coming, the colleagues who talked over her. She spoke not with bitterness, but with clarity. And then she said something that made his breath catch. She said she once shared a row on a flight with someone who didn't think she belonged. She didn't name him. She didn't shame him. She just said that survival reveals who we are when the world stops listening, and that the most powerful change doesn't come from people admitting guilt. It comes from people doing better without being asked. Robert sat frozen in his seat. Around him, the crowd clapped, nodded, took notes, but he didn't move because he knew. That story, it was still about him. But this time, it didn't make him shrink. It made him sit taller, not out of pride, out of responsibility. After the talk, she walked past him in the hallway. She didn't stop. She didn't need to. Their eyes met for half a second. No words, no tension, just recognition. And that was enough. Robert stepped outside into the cool air and felt something let go. Not shame. That had already been burned away. What remained now was something steadier. Accountability. He wasn't a different person, but he was trying to be. And in that quiet space between who he had been and who he wanted to become, there was finally room to grow. A year had passed since the crash, but the memory of that island still lived in Robert's bones. Sometimes he could almost smell the salt air or hear the low crackle of the fire Maria had built every night. He never returned to the man he was before. That version of himself had died somewhere in the wreckage, not with flames or water, but with truth. These days, Robert volunteered twice a week at a local shelter, mostly sorting supplies, sometimes just listening. He didn't talk about the island, didn't tell people what he had learned. He let his choices speak instead. He donated anonymously to a scholarship fund for underrepresented medical students. One day, while scrolling through updates from that program, he saw a headline. Maria had been selected as a visiting professor at a prestigious university. The article praised her work in resilience, psychology, and cross-cultural leadership. But what stood out most wasn't the accolades. It was a quote from her. She said surviving wasn't just about what you did in crisis, it was about what you carried forward after it. Robert read that line again and again. Then he printed it out, folded it carefully, and tucked it into his wallet. He didn't need anything else to remember her by. Not a photo, not a thank you, just those words. Because they weren't just hers anymore. They were his compass now. He didn't know if their paths would ever cross again. It didn't matter. What mattered was that her strength had changed the trajectory of his life, without her ever needing to lift her voice. She had shown him the kind of courage that doesn't come from domination or control, but from conviction, from composure, from compassion. And in a world where loudness is often mistaken for power, Maria had taught him that real power doesn't shout. It endures. It uplifts. It survives. And maybe, just maybe, it leaves behind someone better than who they were. That was her legacy. And that was the story he would carry, long after the island was gone. If this story made you think twice about who we judge, or reminded you that real strength speaks quietly, then don't let it stop here. Share this with someone who needs to hear it. Subscribe for more true stories that challenge what we think we know and reveal what really matters when everything else falls away.